Today we'll be discussing the case of Wesley Autrey. It's January 2007, Manhattan, New York City. Wesley leaves his apartment, heading to the subway station with his two daughters. This is a normal day for him. He just planned to drop the girls off before heading to work. Wesley worked in construction, and like many other New Yorkers, he was taking public transportation to get himself there and back. Nothing would have raised any alarms as he walked through the door of the station and through the turnstile. But very quickly after he got onto that train platform, he saw something that immediately caught his attention. Wesley saw a man collapse right in front of him, and this man soon began convulsing in a seizure. This man was named Cameron, and Wesley quickly ran up to Cameron to provide first aid. Eventually, Cameron was able to get up on his feet, but this recovery only lasted very briefly, because it was just a moment later when Cameron had fallen again. The thing is, this time, Cameron didn't just fall back onto the platform, because instead, Cameron fell right onto the train tracks and began suffering another seizure. Wesley had just a split-second decision to make, because to everyone's horror, as Cameron laid on those tracks, the train was quickly approaching. So close, in fact, everyone was able to see the train lights ahead. Wesley took the risk and hopped onto the tracks to help Cameron, but he needed to work very quickly because as he struggled to lift Cameron up, he only had about 9 seconds before the train was going to be rolling into the station. Wesley was left with only one choice: to lay on the tracks and let the train run right over them. Everyone on the platform was freaking out. People were crying, they were screaming, and they watched as this train ran over these two men. Wesley and Cameron had barely even an inch to spare. But what happened next was something that would leave the entire platform shocked, because to everyone's surprise, Wesley was in fact able to call out from underneath the train and he requested for help. After the news broke, this story spread everywhere, and what would follow for Wesley was something nobody would have ever expected. What was it about Wesley that made him so ready to risk everything? And what would drive just a regular man on a random Tuesday to take such an extreme risk? What experts would unpack about this case is truly something that would make you reevaluate how you go about any emergency situation. But before we get into this case, just to introduce myself, my name is Petal Palmer, and on this channel I post anything medical, mysteries, and crime. If that is something that sounds interesting to you, please consider subscribing if you end up liking this video. Alright, let's get into this case. Wesley James Autrey Sr. was born in Pensacola, Florida on February 6, 1956. He was raised on a farm in Alabama by single mother Mary, a devout Christian who at the time of the case was a retired school cafeteria worker. Wesley was the middle child, being the second oldest of his siblings. He had an older brother, Robert, and two younger sisters, Linda and Lucille. With him being the second oldest of the 4 kids, Wesley was described as the, quote, man of the house, being that his father, who was a construction worker, had left the family when he was just a toddler. Wesley described his mother as having a big influence on his life growing up. They went to church every Sunday, and he described how the values she instilled in him played a role in the actions he ended up taking during this case. At 12 years old in 1968, Wesley and his family moved from living on a farm in Alabama to living in the big city of New York, specifically in the Harlem neighborhood of Upper Manhattan, and it was there where he would spend his teenage years growing up. At the age of 17 in 1974, Wesley joined the Navy, in which he served for 3 years until 1977, and it was around that time when he started in the Navy when Wesley had his first child, a son by the name of Wesley Jr., who everybody referred to as Boo. Wesley Jr. isn't mentioned much in the coverage, but what we do know is that in 2007, at the time of this case, he was 33 years old. After leaving the Navy, Wesley went on to work for the Postal Service. I'm not sure how long he stayed in the Postal Service job, but what is known is that at some point after working this job, he ended up switching fields to work in construction. Shortly before this case happened, Wesley had been working on a school project in the Williamsburg neighborhood in Brooklyn. Not just this, but he also worked as a shop steward in the laborers' Local 79 union. Local 79 is a labor union representing construction workers in New York City. It's the largest construction laborers' local union in the United States, and the scope of work for the union includes various things such as demolition, fireproofing, and scaffolding, for example. In 2001, at 45 years old, Wesley welcomed a daughter, Shuki, into the world, and just 2 years later, in 2003, his youngest daughter, Sashi, was born. Both Shuki and Sashi had a different mother to their older brother, Wesley Jr., but the mother of Shuki and Sashi actually left Wesley when Sashi had still been a baby. Wesley described that he would have actually married her, but he stated that she simply wasn't interested. Still, nonetheless, they ended up co-parenting, with Wesley telling NewYorkMagazine.com, quote, "I thought we had a great thing. The world looks at Black men as deadbeat dads, but that's not me." At the local 79, Wesley had reached a pretty good level of seniority, but even at this level, he had still been living from paycheck to paycheck, and he had to rely on this to provide not just for himself, but for his children and his family. Wesley had lived in a small studio apartment on Riverside Drive, and with his paycheck from construction, he not only provided for his 4 and 6-year-old daughters, but he also would support to some degree his mother, his 2 granddaughters who were 10 and 1, his nieces, nephews, and even his niece's 2-year-old son. A lot of the information of what happened in this case was taken from the interview Wesley did with the Epilepsy Foundation. The links to the 3-part interview will be in the description. On the afternoon of Tuesday, January 2nd, 2007, 50-year-old Wesley had left the apartment with his 2 daughters as he intended to drop them off with their mother before heading to work. At approximately 12:45 p.m., they ended up entering the 137th Street City College subway station in order to catch the downtown number 1 train for an approximate 30-minute ride to the 14th Street Union Square subway station. Wesley and his daughters went through the turnstile and proceeded to head onto the platform. On the platform, there were about 80 to 100 people waiting for the train. The thing about this particular day, though, was there was a young man who Wesley noticed also waiting, and it was only a brief moment later when suddenly Wesley saw that man collapse right onto his back on the platform. This man was 20-year-old Cameron HolloPeter, and he was a film student at the New York Film Academy. Wesley saw that Cameron's arms and legs were moving and that his body was jerking, and he instantly realized that this young man was suffering from a major medical event. Specifically, he recognized that the young man looked to be having a seizure. A seizure is a common neurological event that can affect people of all ages. They are characterized by a sudden burst of electrical activity in the brain. There are many different types of seizures, and they all can cause a variety of different physical and mental symptoms, including staring into space, loss of consciousness or awareness, or jerking movements of the arms and legs, amongst many other symptoms. While a common symptom of seizures that many people know of are convulsions, and a lot of the time the words seizure and convulsions are used interchangeably, it's important to note that there are many different types of seizures, and so not every person suffering a seizure will experience convulsions. Likewise, it's important to note not everyone experiencing a seizure will even lose consciousness. In this case, however, Cameron did exhibit these 2 symptoms, which showed that he was likely experiencing what's called a tonic-clonic seizure, previously known as a grand mal seizure, as this type of seizure is one that is characterized by losing consciousness and experiencing convulsions. After seeing this, Wesley quickly jumped into action. He ran over to the token booth clerk and he told them, "Hey, this man just fell on the platform. It looks like he's having a medical emergency. Could you please call the police and paramedics?" After telling them this, the token clerk did in fact call emergency services, and still with his 2 young daughters by his side, Wesley quickly headed back over to provide aid to Cameron. When Wesley got close to Cameron, he looked directly at his face, and he noticed that there was saliva running out of the side of his mouth. And it wasn't just this, because as Wesley listened, it sounded as if Cameron had been gagging or choking. Whenever someone is unresponsive but still breathing, one of the number 1 things you probably hear cited is to make sure they're not on their back. For example, if somebody is drunk and they're passed out but still breathing, it's recommended that you turn them on their side just in case if they throw up, they wouldn't be choking on it. And this is also done to just keep the airways open. This is called the recovery position, and this position is recommended to use for people who are unresponsive but still breathing in order to keep their airways open and prevent choking. Now, in a scenario where someone is still unresponsive, however not breathing, depending on this situation, that's when it may be recommended to keep the person on their back in order to perform CPR. During a seizure, it's recommended in most cases to only move the person into the recovery position after the seizure has concluded. Typically, health professionals recommend to not move or reposition somebody during the actual seizure unless it's necessary to protect their safety. This could be in cases where they're in the middle of the road or in cases where one is choking. When someone is having a seizure, especially a tonic-clonic seizure, this can cause them to lose consciousness and lose control of their muscles, in turn making it difficult to swallow. So it's common for saliva to pool in one's mouth during this. This was happening with Cameron, and with him being on his back, he was choking on his saliva. Wesley quickly realized that the only way to help this young man was if somebody repositioned him, and with how time-sensitive everything was, Wesley didn't even have a second thought. He quickly moved both of his daughters to be against the wall, the furthest away from the train tracks, and once Wesley was satisfied with their safety, he turned his attention to Cameron. Wesley had learned first aid and various techniques while he was in the Navy and even at the union he worked at. So he got Cameron in position and subsequently began administering first aid on him. Now, Wesley had inserted a pen into Cameron's mouth in order to prevent him from swallowing his tongue. Regarding this, however, for a while, a lot of medical professionals and first aid manuals for seizures did recommend using objects to place in one's mouth to prevent tongue injury or swallowing during a seizure. But now, many experts have cited the idea of one swallowing their tongue during a seizure as a harmful myth. There's a scientific consensus that it would be anatomically impossible to swallow one's tongue, and experts further recommend to not do this as it could end up causing more danger. At some point, Wesley began performing CPR or rescue breathing on Cameron. Now, I'm unsure the specific details regarding Cameron's health emergency, as this rightfully has been kept private, but it is important to note regarding first aid for seizures that during a seizure, it's recommended to not administer CPR, but rather that CPR should only be administered afterwards if the person is not breathing. During the tonic phase of a tonic-clonic seizure, an individual would experience muscle stiffening. Thus, their chest muscles may stiffen, which can cause them to either temporarily stop breathing or breathe very irregularly. This phase lasts for usually under 30 seconds. The clonic phase, on the other hand, is where the individual would experience the convulsions or rapid jerking movements of the muscles. And while breathing should resume during this phase, it may still be very labored. This phase typically lasts for about 1 to 3 minutes. Based on this, I can only assume Cameron had stopped convulsing and was not breathing when Wesley administered the CPR. But again, nothing confirms exactly if this was the case. As mentioned, many people were on the platform at that moment, which Wesley had estimated to be about 80 to 100 people. However, out of everyone that was there, it was just Wesley and 2 other women who had came to Cameron's assistance.
It was like 80 to 100 people. But only me and two other ladies came to the young man, Cameron, assistance. And everybody else was looking at their watch like they was too busy and had some better place or better things to do.
After providing the aid and with Cameron being out of the seizure, he was able to begin getting up. He recovered enough to get to his feet, and as he did this, Wesley stood there just making sure that he was doing fine. But even though he was now up and somewhat getting back to his feet, this recovery only lasted very briefly, because Cameron then staggered and fell again. However, this situation was much worse, because this time he didn't just fall onto the open floor on the platform, but rather Cameron fell backwards off of the platform and onto the train tracks. And worst of it all, at that moment when he fell onto the tracks, there was an oncoming train in the distance coming towards him. Many people at that point started screaming in fear, and of course, with all this commotion, Wesley's daughters too began screaming and crying as well. Now, there were 2 ladies that were there with Wesley's daughters, keeping them safe, and when Cameron fell, Wesley really wanted to help him. However, he described that his youngest daughter, Sashi, followed him everywhere he went, so he knew that if he hopped down there, she would have wanted to follow right behind him. Wesley had a split-second decision to make, and in the end, when he truthfully thought about it, he reasoned, quote, "Do I let the train run him over and hear my daughter screaming and see the blood, or do I jump in?"
I pointed back at the 2 ladies holding my daughters down, and I didn't have a second to lose. Although I looked and I saw this oncoming train, I just felt that I had to do something. Because I was the only person there. It was just on that side. I was the closest, the only man, and the 2 ladies had my daughters. And I knew once I pointed back at them and told them to hold my daughters, I was able to stay focused. Where if they wasn't there to hold my daughters down, my little one would have jumped behind me.
So, just before making this decision, Wesley turned back to look at the women with his 2 daughters. He pointed at them, telling them to hold his daughters down, and after seeing that they were all good, Wesley quickly jumped down onto the tracks to help Cameron. As Wesley was on the tracks, he looked ahead and he could see the train's lights coming towards them. So he tried to pick Cameron up to get him onto the platform. But this was no easy task. Not only were Cameron's arms and legs moving, but when Cameron fell, he landed in the gutter of the tracks. The gutter is the drainage trough between the rails of the tracks, and this area was very wet. So every time Wesley tried grabbing Cameron's hands, the grip just kept slipping apart. Because of this, Wesley then tried to grab Cameron's clothes to attempt to kind of swing him over up onto the platform. But Wesley described, even though he was taller than Cameron, Cameron was much heavier than him, so it was difficult to even do this.
I landed in the gutter and the hand was wet, so each time I grab him, it would slip apart. Each time we slip apart, the train is here now. I go grab his hands again, the train is there now. So last time I just grabbed him by his clothing and brought him up and tried to sling him up on that platform because he was a lot more heavier than me. I had him by height, but he had me by weight.
Lifting him up was not working out, and Wesley knew that if he wanted to save both of their lives, they were going to have to remain on the track. Wesley looked up and saw that the train was very close. He knew that if they stayed there, they were not going to make it. So Wesley thought at that point that the only way he could save him was if he let the train run over them. And by over, I mean over, aka above.
I bear hugged him and brought him back, looked over his shoulder, said, you know what, go for the gutter, and just pushed him back, felt on top of him.
This gutter is typically about 12 inches deep, but it can be as shallow as 8 inches or as deep as 24 inches. And one of the reasons Wesley was actually able to realize that the trough or gutter was deep enough was because the train was getting so close, he was actually able to clearly see the trough from the oncoming lights. Not just this, but he further described how with his training as a construction worker with the Local 79, he often worked in confined spaces, and this helped him assess the situation on the subway tracks, concluding, quote, "The train did have enough room for me," and describing that his mindset in the moment was, quote, "Fool, you got to go in there." In this case, the space was 21 inches deep, which is about 53 centimeters. So while this was going to be a tight fit, it still was just big enough to fit the 2 of them, and the main concern, truthfully, was making sure that no parts of any of their bodies got run over by the train. Once they dove in, Wesley laid right on top of Cameron and wrapped his arms and legs around him. He did not want Cameron's arms or legs getting cut off, so he made sure to hold him firmly, locking his whole body down and keeping Cameron and himself very still. Now, when the train operators saw from the distance that somebody was on the tracks, they pulled the emergency brakes immediately and hit the horn. But with how fast the train was moving, they were unable to stop in time. On the tracks, as the train came in, Wesley could hear the screeching and squealing up the train. It was actually just about 200 feet or 60 meters away when Wesley had jumped down. If you need any way to conceptualize this, on a track like a track and field track, the straightaway is 100 meters. So the train was just a little bit more than half of that away, and it was traveling at about 50 miles per hour or 24 kilometers an hour. So considering if the distance away was in fact correct, at this pace, this would have meant that when Wesley had jumped down on the tracks, he only had about 9 seconds to get Cameron and himself into a safe position. Within milliseconds of dropping Cameron into the bear hug, the train rolled right over the 2 men, and everyone on the platform just were absolutely horrified. Wesley was wearing a blue knitted hat on his head, and when that train came over them, he literally felt his hat being pulled back by the train. Right after he felt this, he quickly ducked his head beside Cameron's, and he said to Cameron, quote,
I'm like, sir, I don't know you, you don't know me, but whatever you do, don't push me up, because if you push me up, I'm gonna get it, and you're gonna be okay. And I got 2 young girls up there that are looking for their father to come up out of this alive.
While they were under the train, Wesley could just hear how loud it was screeching. In fact, it was so loud he wanted to cover his ears, but he knew not to, otherwise he wouldn't be able to hold Cameron down. The front of the train immediately passed over the 2 men, and the first 5 cars of the train rolled over them before the train had stopped. Now, some sources state that it was just the first two cars of the train that passed over the men, with the train coming to a stop on the second car. However, many others do state that it was the first five cars. Nonetheless, despite the amount of cars, this train passed extremely close to Wesley's head, to the point it quite literally grazed his blue knitted cap and smudged it with grease. The space between the men and the underbelly of the train was mere inches, if even an inch, and with any sudden movement or even a slight tilt, Wesley's head would have ended up touching the train. But while potentially touching the train was a big concern, this wasn't the only concern on the tracks, because in addition to worrying about this, on the train tracks there was the third rail, and this rail was electrified, carrying a high voltage of 600 volts of electricity and putting them at risk of being electrocuted. And being that they were lying in water, which can conduct electricity through the ions of the dissolved substances in it, not only were there concerns about them touching the third rail, but there were concerns that if somehow something happened that caused an electric current to start flowing through the water, there was a risk of them being electrocuted from that too. They needed to avoid anything regarding the third rail while also avoiding the train itself from literally running them over. I'm not sure when exactly he got out of the seizure, but Cameron eventually woke up, as Wesley described that Cameron actually began freaking out once the train came to a stop, which rightfully he had just woken up after he experienced two seizures, fell from a high platform onto tracks, was lying in water pinned down with a person he doesn't know on top of him while underneath the train. To say the least, I'm sure that would be very disorienting for anyone. And not just this, but in the postictal phase of a seizure, which is the period after the seizure has concluded, one of the most common symptoms is confusion, and this can last anywhere from a few minutes to several days. Many people on the platform were screaming because they had just witnessed what they believed to be two men being run over by a train. As Wesley was beneath the train, he could hear all the screaming and commotion, and he was concerned for his daughters. So to calm the situation down, he yelled up from underneath the train saying,
I screamed from underneath the train that tell my daughters that I'm okay and the man is okay. That there's two young girls up there. Tell them that their father is okay.
After he said this, everybody started clapping, and Wesley then could hear all the cries of wonder and applause. Wesley explained how with Cameron freaking out, he was moving his arms, trying to break free and grab stuff underneath the train. So because of this, he knocked his arm down and he yelled up, asking for a firefighter and police. Because even though now the train wasn't moving anymore, he was still worried about the possibility of potentially being electrocuted. Cameron fighting and trying to get free is actually something that is common to occur if someone is restrained following a seizure. One of the main first aid tips regarding seizures is to not restrain the person, as this could lead to more confusion, agitation, and aggression. Obviously, this wasn't feasible in this case, as he quite literally needed to be restrained in order to avoid the train. However, this isn't something Cameron or anyone would just know immediately when waking up from a seizure, with Epilepsy.com explaining, quote, "People don't fight on purpose during a seizure, yet if they are restrained when they are confused, they may respond aggressively." Wesley and Cameron remained under the train for approximately 20 minutes while they waited for rescuers to cut the power and get them out. And as they waited during that time, Wesley was speaking with Cameron. He talked about anything and everything to keep Cameron focused and still. Once they were able to make eye contact and Wesley was able to see that he had Cameron's full attention, he continued just talking about anything because he didn't want Cameron to think about moving. And he later explained how he even pinched Cameron because Cameron kept asking if they were dead or in heaven. And he told him, quote, "No, we're under the train. You are very much alive, but if you move, you'll kill the both of us." Once the power was shut off, it became completely dark underneath the train, and at that point, they got to moving. Wesley and Cameron began crawling out from underneath it, and once visible, 5 rescue workers grabbed Wesley and 4 or 5 grabbed Cameron, pulling them onto the platform. When the lights came back on, Wesley's first thoughts were to find his daughters, and once he did, he continued the day as normal, fully unaware of what was to come next for his life following this event. Cameron was taken to the St. Luke's Roosevelt Hospital Center, and fortunately his condition was relatively fine as he only had bumps and bruises. Now, when Wesley exited the subway and spoke to the media, he still had dirt on his hat from it being grazed. But he, on the other hand, refused medical treatment and he actually went home to change clothes and then headed back out, arriving at his job site late. He went on with the day as normal. At work, he was going to be continuing converting classrooms into a library at a school called Public School 380 in Brooklyn, also known as John Wayne Elementary School. And he told his boss why he was late, explaining the situation that occurred at the train station. Wesley's boss didn't believe his story at first, but once he realized it was legit, his boss bought him a hero sandwich, which in other words is a New York-style Italian sub, and Wesley was then given the day off from work. The day after the incident, on Wednesday, January 3rd, Wesley visited Cameron and his family in the hospital. Cameron's father, Larry, addressed the reporters outside saying, quote,
"Mr. Autrey's instinctive and unselfish act saved our son's life.
There are no words to properly express our gratitude and feelings for his actions." And Cameron's stepmother, Rachel, told CBS News on a phone call early that same Wednesday that Wesley was an angel, describing, quote, "He was so heroic. If he wasn't there, this would be a whole different call." Many cheered and hugged Wesley outside the train station, and an onlooker named Patricia Brown, who was actually a Vietnam War veteran, told reporters that Wesley, quote, "needs to be recognized as a hero." The bravery and selflessness Wesley showed on that Tuesday of January 2nd soon brought about a dramatic shift in his life. Initially, right after the incident, Wesley didn't perceive the magnitude of his actions. He told Robert Kolker with New York Magazine, quote, "I didn't think nothing of it. If anything, I thought it was going to make the paper, but that would probably be it." However, the public response quickly escalated, and Wesley soon found himself in the center of the media's attention. As soon as he stepped outside of the subway station on that Tuesday, the News and Post reporters had actually been fighting over who got the chance to drive Wesley to the hospital. But as mentioned, he did refuse medical treatment, so that didn't end up happening. And instead, he would just go on to visit Cameron in the hospital twice. Wesley's story spread very quickly, and he soon went from being just a regular guy living in New York to being thrown into a realm of unexpected fame and recognition. Wesley had become a celebrated hero, even dubbed by the media as the Subway Superman or the Subway Hero. News outlets like Inside Edition and CBS were soon requesting to go back inside the subway station with Wesley so that he could reconstruct the events that occurred.
Kind of stumble and over his own feet and fall backwards. I see a train coming, but the train is so close, I'm like, what do I do?
And within just a day, David Letterman, Ellen, Oprah, Charlie Rose, and Montel were calling Wesley for interviews. With all of these opportunities arising, Wesley's sister, Linda, actually ended up becoming his administrative assistant in order to manage the numerous requests for interviews and appearances. Just the day after the incident on Wednesday, January 3rd, Wesley had 4 different interviews, and by Thursday he had appeared on The Early Show on CBS and also was scheduled to visit City Hall to be honored by the mayor. In addition to these interviews, Wesley was also offered rewards from a multitude of people and organizations. Within just that week, he received a year's worth of free subway rides from the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, which runs the subway station in New York. He received a $10,000 check from Donald Trump, a week-long all-expenses-paid trip to Disney World for himself and his family, and a $5,000 scholarship fund for his daughters, which was actually given by the New York Film Academy where Cameron went to school. He also eventually received season tickets for 2 years to see the Nets play basketball. He went to the Super Bowl the following month. He received a car, a fur coat, and other gifts for his daughters. Wesley went on to travel for interviews in multiple different places in the nation, such as California, but he also started being interviewed in places like Germany, for example. On Friday the 5th, Wesley received the Bronze Medallion Award presented by Mayor Michael Bloomberg. This is the city's highest award for civic achievement, with past recipients including Martin Luther King Jr., Muhammad Ali, and also World War II General Douglas MacArthur. And the latest person who received this before him was a man named Felix Vasquez, who was awarded in 2005 after catching a baby who was thrown from a burning building. That Sunday, on the 7th, Wesley still went to his church as usual, but instead of being just a member in the congregation, his pastor, who was very happy to see him, gave him time to speak to the congregation. Many people actually were waiting and hoping to hear him speak there, to hear about everything that had happened. The next week, on Thursday, January 11th, the American Stock Exchange wanted Wesley to ring the opening bell. The following week, the governor, Spitzer, wanted him for an event on the 17th, and the week after that, on January 23rd, Wesley was recognized at the State of the Union and addressed by then President George W. Bush, who commended his bravery, stating, quote, "There is something wonderful about a country that produces a brave and humble man like Wesley Autrey." It was there where he did a gesture of blowing a kiss that morphed into peace signs, which eventually became kind of like a trademark for him, especially in Harlem. Through all this attention, Wesley stayed very humble and always emphasized that he didn't view himself as a hero, but rather that he did the right thing and hoped other New Yorkers would do the same if they were to see somebody in distress. He expressed surprise at his own actions, even describing his act of jumping in front of the train as being, quote, "pretty stupid." But he stated that he would do this again, further stating that he was not looking for recognition for what he had done, but rather that he believed that the real heroes were those serving in Iraq, since at the time of this case in 2007, there was the Iraq War, which lasted from 2003 to 2011. Now, with all of the media attention, Wesley was getting recognized every time he went outside, and at first, things seemed to be going relatively fine, but it eventually got to the point where the constant public attention and demands on his time began taking a toll on him. The 5-minute walk from his apartment to the subway now took 20 minutes for him because there just was so many people stopping him for pictures, hugs, and even requesting for donations. He also found himself in a constant cycle of appearances and interviews and just had all these eyes on him, which he was not necessarily prepared for. He appreciated all of the support, but it was a lot, so he did start feeling worn out. He mentioned that people were asking him for handouts. In fact, he described that for the first time in 30 years, he had heard from his father, who was living in Pensacola, Florida, asking him for money. After all those years, according to Wesley, his father did not ask about him nor his daughter's well-being. Instead, he rather said, quote, "There's a family reunion coming, and if you're coming, bring me some of that money you got." He described the attention he was getting from women at bars, for example, and even from someone who had reached out after dumping him 15 years prior. And worst of it all, with all of the things he had scheduled, he was starting to miss spending time with his daughters on the weekends. He knew that these opportunities were important because these opportunities would be able to help so that he could better provide for his family. And he tried to explain this to his daughters, that this new job could lead them to getting a house and just overall living a better life. But they were young, so at the time, they didn't understand. Wesley's life had changed so much that his niece Kiana told him, quote, "Uncle Wesley, I think you might have to realize that the construction worker, he died on the 2nd. There's a new you. The public wants this new you." After the subway incident, Wesley was on leave from work to make all the appearances. But even though he had fully intended to go back to work at the construction company, with the opportunities he was being presented, this wasn't looking like it would be the reality for him. Making money was never his priority in anything related to the case. However, being on leave, he was already 4 weeks out of receiving no paychecks, while at the same time being approached by various people with ideas for endorsements, books, and movies. And with all the goals he had for himself and his family, he decided to truly look into the possibility of capitalizing on his newfound fame. And he figured that to do so, he would need professional help. After briefly working with a PR consultant, in the beginning of February, Wesley began working with a show business veteran named Mark Esposito and a business partner named Diane Kleinman. Wesley stated that initially Kleinman had introduced herself as an attorney, but eventually after signing the contract, he discovered that she signed off on the contract not as an attorney, but as a business partner. And he also realized that in signing the contract, he gave the pair 50% of the profits related to his brand. Very quickly after signing the contract, the pair began doing some shady things, and eventually Esposito went on to even state that he was the one who owned the, quote, intellectual property of Wesley's story, not Wesley. Wesley ended up filing a lawsuit against the two, seeking damages and also seeking to void the contract, with this lawsuit claiming that the two had exploited his name and personality and that they rushed him into signing a contract as part of an unconscionable scheme. Still, with all of these legal issues that were going on, Wesley and his family were able to continue making appearances on shows such as Deal or No Deal, and there was talk of Wesley making an appearance on the TV show Heroes, which was a superhero drama television series. By Wednesday, November 6, 2007, Wesley had settled the lawsuit with Esposito and Kleinman. Finally, Wesley was not required to work with them, and despite the challenges and the lawsuit, he was able to remain committed to using his fame for good as he'd hoped to. He spoke at many schools and even thought about starting an after-school program for kids in his neighborhood. In fact, he stated that the young people who wrote poems, books, and songs about him at a school in Westbury, New York, where he visited, were, quote, much more rewarding than any of the gifts he's received and even more rewarding than his visit to the White House. He also went on to attend epilepsy walks, such as in Washington, D.C. in 2007, where he received the Heroes of Epilepsy Award, adding alongside the many other awards he's achieved, and he actually described these awards as being enough for him to open up a museum. Wesley had the goals of having these epilepsy walks and events spread worldwide in order to raise more awareness. In this case, Cameron had suffered 2 seizures, and what you might not know is that seizures are actually more common than many might realize. A common neurological disorder you might know of that is characterized by recurring seizures is one called epilepsy. Experts estimate that approximately 1 in 26 people will develop epilepsy at some point in their lives. However, not every person who experiences a seizure has epilepsy. There are various factors such as health conditions, medications, head injuries, high fever, electrolyte imbalances in the body, or even withdrawal, which may trigger a single seizure. It's possible for somebody to experience a seizure unexpectedly. In fact, 1 in 100 people in the United States have experienced a single unprovoked seizure or have been diagnosed with epilepsy. And studies suggest that up to 8% of people may have at least one seizure during their life. A diagnosis of epilepsy is not solely made based on the number of seizures one had, but rather is made based on a comprehensive evaluation, including medical history, neurological examination, and/or EEG findings. In the United States, an estimated 3.4 million people have epilepsy, which is equivalent to 1.2% of the population. And the prevalence of epilepsy varies across different regions and age groups. Studies have shown that children and older adults, especially above the age of 60, are more likely to develop epilepsy than individuals who are young or middle-aged adults. And as mentioned, people with certain conditions may also be at greater risk, such as those with autism or Alzheimer's disease. Still, nonetheless, anyone could develop epilepsy regardless of their age and regardless of their health status. While there are many possible causes of epilepsy, in about 50% of the cases, the cause is actually unknown. However, there are several factors that are known that can contribute to its development. This includes genetic influence, head trauma, brain abnormalities, infections, prenatal injury, and developmental disorders, amongst many others. Epilepsy is a broad term that is used to describe a brain disorder causing recurring seizures, but there are many different types of epilepsy. Seizures are classified into different types based on where they originate in the brain and the symptoms they produce. The 2 main categories are generalized seizures and focal seizures. And depending on the type or types of seizures that occur, there are different types of epilepsy one might be diagnosed with. A key difference between these types of seizures is the impact they have on awareness and consciousness. Generalized seizures involve both sides of the brain and typically cause a loss of consciousness, whereas focal seizures start in one specific area of the brain and may or may not involve the loss of consciousness depending on the affected brain region. This means that with a focal seizure, it's possible to have what's called a focal aware seizure, where the person is fully awake and alert and can recall what happened. In some of these cases, the individual may be unable to respond to anyone during it. However, these typically last for a brief period of just below 2 minutes. Focal seizures are the most common type of seizure experienced by those who have epilepsy, as the most common type of epilepsy is what is called temporal lobe epilepsy. This is a type of epilepsy where seizures originate in the temporal lobe of the brain. On the other hand, the most common type of generalized seizure is the tonic-clonic seizure, which is said to occur in about 25% of adult patients and was likely the one that Cameron had experienced. While most cases of epilepsy cannot be prevented, it's estimated that about 25% of cases could possibly be prevented. And overall, there are measures that can be taken to reduce the risk of seizures or to manage the condition effectively. These can be broadly categorized into lifestyle changes and medical interventions, with the lifestyle changes including getting enough sleep, managing stress, maintaining a healthy diet, avoiding alcohol and drugs, and medical interventions including different medications such as anti-seizure medications, which are the primary treatment for epilepsy, and also including vagus nerve stimulation, which involves a device being implanted under the skin around the chest, which sends electrical impulses to the vagus nerve, in turn helping in regulating brain activity. Likewise, in addition to the general preventive measures mentioned above, it's also very essential to identify and avoid specific triggers that may increase the risk of seizures for one that does have epilepsy. These triggers can vary from person to person, but some common ones include specific times of day or night, illness, especially with a high fever, flashing lights, menstrual cycle or hormonal changes, not eating enough or dehydration, and even specific foods, as some people may have specific food triggers. Of course, as discussed, you still may never know when or if someone may experience a seizure at any given moment. That's why if you ever witness someone having a seizure, it's important to remain calm and keep in mind the following steps to take. The acronym CARE is commonly used to remember the steps to assist someone who's having a seizure, and a lot of these steps are ones that Wesley had performed when helping Cameron. This acronym stands for Comfort, Action, Reassure, and Emergency, and it involves C, cushioning one's head with something soft, A, timing the seizure and clearing the area, also checking for any type of medical ID bracelet, R, placing someone in the recovery position when the seizure has stopped and staying with them as they regain consciousness, and E, calling emergency services if the seizure continues for more than 5 minutes, the person goes into another seizure without regaining consciousness, has trouble breathing after the seizure, has never had a seizure before, or is injured. Also, just calling emergency services in general is recommended, especially if you are unsure what to do and need assistance. Many professionals have analyzed cases like Wesley Autrey's, looking at the various psychological and social factors that could have contributed to prompting someone to help in an emergent situation, and the reasons why someone would choose to intervene. What Wesley demonstrated with his actions was something called altruism. Altruism is defined as the unselfish concern for the welfare of others. Research has suggested that altruistic actions can actually activate reward centers in the brain, which could essentially contribute to positive emotions for the one doing the action, and in turn encourage them to do more altruistic actions. And these actions can range from everyday gestures such as holding a door open for someone to life-saving interventions such as, in some cases, donating an organ to a stranger. There's also something called the social responsibility norm, which is a societal expectation that one should help when somebody is in need. To better understand the decision-making process involved in helping behavior, especially in this case, we can apply the 5-step model proposed by social psychologists Latine and Darley, which include 1, noticing the event, 2, interpreting the event as an emergency, 3, assuming responsibility, 4, knowing how to help, and 5, deciding to implement the help. In Wesley's case, he clearly noticed the event of Cameron falling on the tracks. He interpreted it as an emergency, as there was an oncoming train which posed a direct threat. He assumed responsibility as he acted despite the presence of others. He knew how to help as he shielded Cameron in a safe location, and he decided to implement the help as he jumped onto the tracks to help him. Wesley described that even during the first seizure, when Cameron was safely on the platform, other than himself and the 2 other women who helped, a lot of people on the platform were checking their watches and just standing there waiting for the train, essentially appearing to pay no mind to the situation. One might ask, why was it that Wesley and the couple women were the only ones to jump into action? This is where conversations of what is called the bystander effect were brought up. The bystander effect is a social psychological phenomenon theorizing that individuals are less likely to offer help to somebody when there are other people who are present. With the bystander effect, it's stated that as the number of people around increases, the probability of help decreases. This effect can be attributed to several factors, including diffusion of responsibility, social influence, and evaluation apprehension. With diffusion of responsibility, it's described that whenever there's multiple people witnessing an emergency, the responsibility to intervene becomes diffused amongst them. So this causes the tendency for each bystander to assume that somebody else will take action, and thus eventually leads to collective inaction. For example, one scenario my psychology professors would always mention would be a scenario where there's somebody pulled over on the side of the highway or freeway as their car had broken down. There's a good chance a lot of the people on the highway or freeway are going to simply drive past that person because there's a lot of other people driving on the road. One might reason that somebody else is obviously going to stop to help. This is especially amplified when people perceive others as likely being more capable of helping, such as doctors or EMTs, especially in the case of Cameron, who is suffering a medical emergency. Many genuinely might not know what to do when a health emergency is happening and could have the thought that even touching the person might make the situation worse. This also brings up the factor of social influence, which describes the tendency of people to look to others for cues on how to react in ambiguous situations. If people appear unconcerned or inactive, it could lead to others mistakenly believing that a situation is not an emergency because no one else is reacting. And lastly, this also ties into evaluation apprehension, because even if one does recognize that there is a need for help, many may hesitate to help due to the fear of being judged or being negatively evaluated by others, especially if the situation is ambiguous or the appropriate response is unclear. That being said, while still a commonly demonstrated and thoroughly studied phenomenon, there are other studies which suggest that bystander intervention, where somebody does help, is actually more common than the bystander effect. For example, a 2020 study which reviewed over 200 videos of real-life interactions found that in 91% of those cases, at least one bystander intervened. In general, it is an interesting and complicated topic, as there are so many different variables that can affect each case and various factors that can play a role in how one might react to a situation. And this just makes it a bit more difficult to be able to properly measure bystander intervention and determine what exactly happened. From what it sounds like, the incident with Cameron when he fell onto the tracks was a very time-sensitive and dangerous situation. I mean, the train lights were approaching in the distance, so anything that happened needed to be done quick. This could have made it harder for others to fully process what to do in the situation and make the decision to hop into action. As for the lack of help on the actual platform during the first seizure, since it lacks the danger and time-sensitive aspect, this more so could represent a clearer example of the phenomenon. But when he fell on the actual tracks, being how dangerous that situation would have been for anyone, this is where more factors can play a role in how one intervenes, because for them to hop in, that would put their life at risk as well. That being said, studies have shown that in certain cases, danger is in fact positively associated with bystander intervention. A 2021 study concluded that, quote, bystanders are more likely to intervene when danger is present than when danger is absent, but that there is not enough evidence to conclude that the intensity of the danger makes their intervention either more or less likely. Their study involved intervention shown in cases of conflict, and they found that people were more likely to step in when there was aggression associated with the conflict as opposed to when there was not. While intervention could present danger for the person who steps in, these studies show that with conflict, bystanders typically don't perceive it as a high-risk situation for them to step in. And this actually has been shown in these studies, as they found that with conflicts, it's actually rare for the bystanders to be victimized when stepping in. And in cases where they are victimized, it's typically nothing severe like being hit by a train, but rather just a light push or even a hit. That's what makes cases like Wesley's so interesting, because regardless of the dangers which could have posed a guaranteed death, none of these factors stopped him from taking the actions to help Cameron both on the platform and on the tracks. There are several factors cited which may explain why Wesley felt that he did in fact need to intervene. For one, he had clarity of the emergency, prompting him to act decisively. He had belief in his perceived ability to help, especially with being a construction worker and a Navy veteran. He likely had the confidence in his abilities and physical strength that would have been needed to help Cameron out. Wesley himself stated that with Cameron being bigger than him, he did have a hard time trying to lift him up. So if you take someone who's really small and doesn't really have a lot of muscle, they might reasonably know there's no way I'm going to realistically be able to get this man off the track safely. safely. And thus, they rightfully reasoned that it would almost be pointless kind of for them to try. Wesley likely believed that he did have the capability. It was just a matter of trying to see if it was possible. And lastly, even disregarding his clarity of their emergency and perceived ability to help, Wesley had a strong focus on the victim himself, Cameron. Wesley's attention truthfully could have solely been focused on Cameron's plight, as he didn't want to see a young man lose his life in such a horrific way, and this concern could have overridden any social influences or concerns about personal risk. In the aftermath of this whole case, Wesley had stated that he had not changed and that he still remained a mellow guy. He believed that God had blessed him and his family, and further described that he didn't have any complaints. As for Cameron, he rightfully didn't want to be in the public eye, but fortunately, Wesley was still able to stay in contact with Cameron and his family. 2 years after the incident, in 2009, Wesley alongside both of his daughters and Cameron alongside his parents were able to meet up at a Midtown restaurant for a 3-course meal. In 2012, 5 years after the incident, Wesley was still being hailed for his courage, and when asked if he would do it again, he still responded with an absolute yes. And as of more current events, on September 30th, 2021, a statue of Wesley created by sculptor Joseph Reginella was displayed in Union Square alongside statues of 4 others who have done heroic acts for strangers as part of a public art campaign hosted by the I Am Your Protector organization, an organization which, quote, transcends perceived lines of division between different communities and endeavors to change the way people view the other. Wesley posed for a picture beside his statue, stating, quote, "It's an honor to be known as one of the protectors because with what's going on today, we've got a lot of racial tension. We've got a lot of injustice." Furthermore, in 2022, Wesley was featured in a Publishers Clearinghouse commercial as the winner of a sweepstakes prize. He was tracked down by a camera crew at the 137th Street subway station where his heroic act had taken place, and it was discovered that he still lived in Harlem, staying a longtime member of the community. All in all, this was a very touching story, and it truly just emphasizes the importance of being aware of steps one could take when witnessing a medical emergency. What Wesley did was extremely courageous and brave, and hopefully this story can encourage others to take action, not necessarily in a dangerous situation like this one, but just in any situation where it's clear one needs help. But yes, that is it for this video. What are your thoughts on this case? Please comment your thoughts below, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any other videos on medical cases, crime, and mysteries. Bye now.